Good morning. My name is Abigail Calderon Garcia, and today I'll be presenting on Eradicating History or Embracing Change, the debate about renaming Brooklyn to Cesar Chavez Avenue in East Los Angeles in the 1990s. So before I get started with just talking about the project at large, I want to talk a little bit about myself and why I got interested in the project. So I'm a student from Cal State LA. I'm an undergraduate there. I'm a Mellon Mace Fellow. I'm a history major with a minor in Asian American Studies, and my research interests are multiracial coalition building, public memory and commemoration, borderlands, and relational ethnic studies. And part of the reason why I got so interested in all of these things was because growing up, my parents owned a store in Boyle Heights. And you can see down here shops on East Los, in Cesar Chavez, not specifically my parents, but a couple others that are in the surrounding area. And so growing up, I got to talk to a lot of people in this area and sort of find out a lot of community history. And that really got me interested, specifically because I grew up seeing things like the Breed Street Shoal and being extremely curious as to why it was there. And for a long time, it was abandoned and in disrepair. And I was just so curious as to why that was there. And a lot of other monuments and a lot of other things in the community that were either abandoned or were there to commemorate certain people, certain groups of people that I was just super curious about. So that got me interested in this name change. And well, seemingly sort of innocuous, right? It's name change, and it's really the replacement of a sign. Really, the name change reveals the complexity of local and inter community politics, as well as the active and fluid reimaginations of history. So now getting into it, on May 4th, 1993, Los Angeles County Board Supervisor Gloria Molina proposed a renaming of Brooklyn Avenue to Cesar Chavez Avenue. And this really started a debate on whether or not this changing of a name would really erase history or not emphasize sort of the real big contributions that the Jewish community that wasn't there at this time had towards the area. And so really that's echoed in Dean Zellman, one of the few remaining Jewish business owners on the avenue. And he states, change First Street, change 4th Street. There are many parks. Mr. Chavez must be honored, but not at the expense of others' history. And so this really strikes at the core of, are we forgetting, are we erasing history by changing this name? Um, so in order to understand the history of the area and what exactly is at stake here, we need to go back in time and sort of look at Boyle Heights. So Boyle Heights was originally not meant to be this multi-ethnic space. Actually, it was envisioned as a suburban sort of escape from downtown Los Angeles. So when the land came under U.S. control, uh, uh, Andrew Boyle bought 42 acres of land, and eventually this ended up in the possession of his son-in-law William Workman. And William Workman, as a city council member and as a mayor of the city of Los Angeles, really worked towards giving Boyle Heights the necessary infrastructure, along with Brooklyn Land and Building Company and a couple other investors that were really interested in selling the area. And they were really trying to promote it as a suburban escape. And I think that's really shown in this picture of Hollenbeck Park in 1908. At some point, it was called the prettiest park in LA. And it's also shown in a lot of other buildings in the area that are these really pretty old Victorian style houses. And really, it was meant to attract um, white Anglo elites coming from the East Coast. And you can still see that even in like names such as Chicago that are still there. Certain streets are really meant to attract this sort of this inflow of white migrants at the time. However, that doesn't necessarily happen. It does to an extent, but this really shifts, and it's a very small time period, uh, and that's because of city zoning laws that get enacted in 1908 and the perpetuated racial racial residential segregation in the form of racial covenants, and that really bar minorities and people of color from from the west side of Los Angeles that was designated as a residential area. So as a result of this, you get a multi-ethnic neighborhood, and as you can see here, you have this picture of the Hollenbeck Student City Council in the 1940s, and you can see a mix of different people. On the other side, you have a Yiddish day school. You also have Mexican American zoot suiters, you have Russian Molkins, and you have Russian Christian pacifists. So really, it's a mix of people, and they're all coming together in this small space. So this also changes eventually with time, and a lot of this, there's a lot of factors, but specifically I'm going to be focusing on a lot of things that came as a result of World War II. So at the end of World War II, you have a lot of people coming in, a lot of veterans from all racial groups returning. You have Japanese Americans that are just released from internment camps. You have Mexican immigrant braceros making their way towards urban centers downtown and towards Boyle Heights from the San Joaquin and Imperial Valleys. Um, and so you have this housing crisis that goes on in Boyle Heights during this time period. And this is further aggravated by the fact by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 that basically cuts through Boyle Heights. There's various freeways that actually cut through Boyle Heights, and a lot of housing gets destroyed. And what also adds to all of this is the fact that there is changing definitions of what it means to be white, and you get the prevalence of the term Caucasian being used more, and within that, Jewish Americans are included, and so they're allowed access to certain residential areas that they had previously been barred from. So all of this sort of accelerates the process of people moving out of the neighborhood. And by the time you come into the 1990s, Boyle Heights is now predominantly Hispanic, according to the census term. And during this time period, so now you have a predominantly Latinx, Chicanx neighborhood, and you're also in the 1990s in California. And I think there's a lot of important context in California in the 1990s that needs to be understood to know where the name place is sort of taking place. So during this time period in the 1990s, California is going through a lot of issues. For one, it's experiencing its longest recession since the 1930s, and by November of 1992, the state's unemployment rate has hit a 10.1%. There's also a lot of xenophobia going on, manifested through a couple propositions, and also heightened race relations as epitomized by the Rodney King riots. So all of this is coming together, and I'm not trying to separate them into three different categories because they're all sort of contingent on one another. But all of this is taking place, and it's setting the stage for the sort of context of this name change. So in the 1990s, the proposer of the name change is Gloria Molina. Gloria Molina, she has a lot of firsts in her career. She's the first Latina woman to be elected to the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. She's also the first Latina woman to be put in the California State Assembly. But for her career was a lot of sort of pushing back because for a long time, and especially at the beginning of her career, she's told by a lot of her Latino male politicians that she can't do any of this, that she's not capable of, as a woman, being a successful politician. So when she's proposing this name change, it really needs to be sort of noted that her sort of relationship with Cesar Chavez isn't exactly a straightforward relationship. It's somewhat complicated. So at the beginning, when all of this is going on, some important context is to know that during Molina's first campaign for state assembly, Cesar Chavez actually kind of sullies her reputation by saying Gloria is anti-union and anti-farm worker, and really promoting her opponent, which was Richard J. Blanco. And she's really breaking into this male-dominated Latino politician scene. And so for her, this really is him saying that was a really big point of it really upset her because in the same sort of interview she states she's asked like what matters more to in terms of like what constituents see, and she makes a point of saying image is very important, and she even goes, and I don't have the quote on here, but she goes as far as saying if you can get a letter from Jimmy Carter and the community loves Jimmy Carter, well, that's already a huge boost to your image. So what I'm trying to explain here is that their relationship wasn't exactly like, yes, we both love each other. There clearly was some tension, and really, this is her breaking into this male-dominated scene. And so for her, it's really important to start forming these connections. And if her constituents can see that she's associated with someone as prevalent as Cesar Chavez and really pushing this name change forward, it's going to please a lot of her constituents. So a lot of people a lot of the people who are opposing the name change are really making note of that. And so I have a quote right here. So one of the constituents, a resident from Sunset, says, "Why is it that so many people feel the need to basically reflect their political affiliations?" And the quote goes on to further say, in order to sort of boost their political image. Of course, Gloria Molina and her supporters said, no, that's not what this is about. In fact, it's actually something that's really important at this time because this community is under attack. And you can really see that in propositions taking place in California, such as the English only movement that actually passed. And it was basically saying, English is the official language of California, and it was really targeting a lot of minority communities. Prop 187, while it's further down in the timeline, this happens in 94 and this is going on in 93. Prop 187 didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, a lot of the sort of campaigning and sort of the momentum was going on at the same time. And there was this conversation of immigrants, specifically targeting the Mexican American community, are taking our resources during a time where California is going through a recession. And we need to stop that. In fact, one of the ways that Prop 187 was known was Save Our State. And again, it was because of this rhetoric being used by people who were supporting Prop 187 that immigrants were taking vital community resources. And even though this was specifically towards immigrants, a lot of people in the community and politicians, Latino politicians, were saying, no, this isn't just something that's targeting immigrants, but it's also targeting our community entirely, because once you pass a law that says you need to show your documentation or your citizenship in order to get social services, who's going to be asked for that documentation? Is it going to be somebody who is white presenting, or is it somebody who's brown or a person of color? So in these, all of this is going on, and Molina and her supporters are really saying it's important to give people of Boyle Heights, the Mexican American community, representation, and show and really make this a representation of Chicano power. So another thing that's sort of factoring into this is the fact that when picking someone to be the representation of Chicano power, a lot of her supporters, such as Hilda El Solis, a member of the 57th district, is really stating we need a positive role model for our children, because California is experiencing a time of social and economic downturn, and there is this huge emphasis on we need a positive role model. And now the problem with that is that, and the context behind this is like I said, there's a lot of heightened race relations at this time, and really you can see that through the Rodney King riots. And a lot of the rhetoric used during the Rodney King riots was, they're not paying attention to us when we protest peacefully. Our communities are under attack. There's extreme police brutality, And really, during the riots, all of this sort of blows up, and it becomes a much more radical and violent way to sort of assert political power. And so really a lot of these letters are a lot of the letters and protests are echoing the fact that California is going through this and they're just getting out of these riots. So really, when you look at positive role models, and along with who the city council is sort of signaling as positive role models, which were people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and putting Cesar Chavez with them, it's to um, sort of trying to disassociate with more radical ways of sort of trying to look for political change and trying to really tell the community, no, this is your positive role model. This is who you have to look towards to enact change. Someone like Chavez, and you need to be like him. And this didn't come without any pushback. A lot of the letters sent into the city council were saying, it doesn't seem to me like Cesar Chavez has anything to do with this community. A lot of his work was in the San Fernando Valley. And here I'm not trying to say that Cesar Chavez wasn't influential to the Mexican American community, but rather that a lot of people in this area felt that he didn't represent them. And with the whole emphasis on nonviolence, it was really, to a lot of people, it felt like the city council was trying to police their behavior and police the neighborhood. And then you get into the sort of whole whether or not Brooklyn Avenue represents the Jewish community. Because one of the things that the city council is really hitting on is that the Jewish community is no longer there. They've left. The demographics have changed. The area is predominantly Latinx, Chicanx. Why would we keep the name? Because as their sort of letters to the Cultural Heritage Commission is saying, well, Brooklyn Avenue symbolizes the Jewish community. The problem with that is that it really doesn't. And Brooklyn Avenue is actually named after Brooklyn Land and Building Company. And so it was never meant to symbolize the Jewish community. And at the beginning of the presentation, I sort of showed how the area was never meant for the Jewish community or to be multi-ethnic or any of these things, but really it was meant for a suburban escape. So for the city council to say that Brooklyn Avenue symbolizes a Jewish community is a bit of it's a bit misleading. And that's not to say that the Jewish community, of course, didn't have a lot of centers of activity and did have a lot of contributions to this area. However, a lot of residents felt like, well, Brooklyn Avenue, I might not be Jewish, but it represents me. And that's something that's hit on by Stefan Sotelo, and he's the owner of Cinco Puntos, which is a restaurant in Boyle Heights. And he says, I personally feel like Brooklyn is East Los Angeles as Rodeo is Beverly Hills. And he's Hispanic, but he's grown up his entire life there. And he feels like Brooklyn Avenue isn't exclusively Jewish. So then it comes into question like, well, should the name be changed if it means a lot more to a lot of other residents? But again, California is going through a lot of changes, and the neighborhood, in many ways, is under attack, and that's evident in propositions like Prop 187 and the English only movement. So really what this research is attempting to highlight is how a community goes about looking at divergent views that are manifested at this time period and amending their multi-ethnic past with the needs of the Latinx, Chicanx community at the time. And so this is really a continuous process rooted in how street names both discipline and commemorate a community. And their process is tied to shifting demographics and how communities reprioritize memory. And this process, again, demonstrates that history does not merely happen, but it's also invented and deployed by stakeholders and people who have interests in sort of influencing narratives. And so now, looking forward towards my research in the future, I'm really curious as to how these processes take place in something like the Breed Street Shoal. The Breed Street Shoal was abandoned for many years, but now it's being renovated through a joint community effort between the Jewish and the Latinx community in the area. And the shoal is being renovated, but inside it's a community center. And right now they're focusing on giving free music classes to people to the community where this was needed because there wasn't many music programs. So I'm curious as to see how these conversations carry out in a place like the Breed Street Shoal. Um, and finally, I would just like to acknowledge all the people who helped me, all of my mentors, and people who really guided my research questions and guided me in this process. And they were very, very helpful and really, really helped me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail. Did you happen to look at any other street renamings? Like the other really big one I'm aware of was Santa Barbara Avenue was renamed to Martin Luther King Boulevard.
Yeah, I took a look at a couple other street namings. I remember reading that one, but I don't fully remember the context. But there's a couple of neighborhoods like in the South that have these renamings taking place. And what I noticed in those renamings was that the conversation was largely about whether or not the name belonged in that specific community. So one of the ones that comes to mind was one I think it was taking place in Kansas. I forget, but it was a predominantly white neighborhood, and they were changing it to Martin Luther King. And so a lot of the conversation was like, well, why do we need to have this here? And so it really brought into question of like, who are like these acts important to? Because a lot of the residents were like, well, this doesn't represent my history. Why do I need to have this here? And I don't remember what the outcome of that was. I think they actually might have even reversed because they did change the name, but but the protests came afterwards and people getting upset about it because they felt like it just wasn't a part of their history, which again begs the question of well, clearly Martin Luther King was important to the entire nation, but where are these names being placed, in what communities, and why, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I see now we do have a couple questions in the Q&A. One asks, can you discuss your sources a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the largest sources I had was from the Los Angeles City Archives. I took a look at one specific council file that basically put together a lot of letters sent in protests, everything that the city council was doing, all of the forums that they had, along with a couple newspaper clippings, and then from there I expanded that towards looking at articles from the 1990s and what was going on there. I also looked at previously recorded oral histories, and then had a couple email correspondences with a couple of folks just to sort of really like contextualize a lot of these things. And I really wish I could have conducted more oral histories, but because of the whole COVID situation, I was really sort of not able to do that.
I'm curious, did you visit the archives, or was that all during COVID and that council file must have been scanned for you?
No, I actually visited the
Oh,
archives.
okay.
Yeah, I got to work with Michael Holland, and he was really helpful in just taking a look. And I was really happy that I actually ended up scanning the whole all of the papers that I thought were really like necessary that day, because that sort of stopped me from having to go backwards and forwards. So I was really happy I was able to do that day.
Right. We have one more question. Will you be able to research in the future to examine the Asian American community? I'm not sure what street names have maybe been completed to highlight the Asian American community, but will you look at that?
Yeah, so in my research, I actually wasn't able to include this in this presentation just because I didn't want to make it super long. But in my paper, I discuss so the renaming was Brooklyn Avenue, which is the one that this presentation mainly addressed, a vestige of Macy's Street, because Macy's had already been changed once, and there was only a little portion of Macy's, so that didn't really cause much. No one was really upset about that just because it was such a small little portion.
Yeah.
And a portion of Sunset Boulevard. And that one was really contentious because it connected Sunset and Chinatown. And so with Chinatown, a lot of at this time California is going through a recession, and Chinatown's tourism is also dropping, and there's a lot of gentrification going on in Chinatown. So a lot of Chinese merchants are actually saying, well, this is going to greatly affect us because now we can't rely off of the tourism that is coming from Sunset Boulevard down from Hollywood. All of that's going to be taken away. And so that was something I didn't really go into in this presentation, but I really am hoping on really expanding that portion in my research because it is somewhat towards the end, and I want to really sort of expand on that portion.
I see another question in the chat. How do you think we should balance the history of an area with changing culture or demographics?
Yeah, that was something that I really questioned throughout the entire time of doing this research. And it was something that was really sort of difficult for me to sort of make an evaluation on and a full sort of form an opinion, because clearly there is a lot of things that are going into changing the name, both thinking about the history and also sort of the demographic changes. But I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot of other ways to sort of get around this. And I think that community needs should be at the forefront of whatever is going on. And with this, the community should be involved. Because with the city council changing the name, there was support from the community, but the community wasn't really directly asked. So I think that with anything that's going to take place in a community, there should be active participation from community members, and they should be asked. And I think that that's a great way of sort of balancing the two out by actually seeing what the community actually wants to do and what they want to say, and how they want to sort of represent themselves.
I see one last question here in the chat. How do you see the format or the formal or lack of a formal naming process for streets and monuments between 1993 and today? How did the lack of a formal process by the city impact this?
Well, I think the lack of a formal process really upset a lot of residents, both from Sunset and from Brooklyn Avenue. A lot of them wrote in very strong letters saying I'm very offended that you wouldn't contact us, that you wouldn't say anything. And there was a lot of meetings that not a lot of people were made aware of. And I think that really impacts just how the community is going to take a name change and how they're going to sort of feel about it, especially when the whole claim is that the name change is supposed to represent them and help them. But if the community isn't involved, then there is going to be a portion of detractors. I mean, there would be anyway, but there'll be a greater number of them, especially if they feel like they're not being heard.
Very good. Well, thank you. There are also numerous comments in the chat, just giving kudos and shout outs to you. And also there were some to Moises. I didn't read them all, but that's why they're in the chat. I hope you'll take the time to scroll through there.